Hey everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about the Book of Mormon and DNA studies. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. So to start off, why are we talking about this? Well, the Book of Mormon is central to the LDS faith and has been described as the keystone of our religion by Joseph Smith, the first prophet of the latter days. And so for this reason, critics and members of the church have tried to use DNA studies to prove or disprove the Book of Mormon. And so today, what I wanted to discuss through this presentation is what DNA can and can't tell us about the Book of Mormon. So to start off, what do we know? So we know from the text of the Book of Mormon that the Book of Mormon contains a record of God's dealings with three different groups of people who came to the Americas from the Near East, also known as West Asia, and they would have come hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. And so if we look at the evidence that we have, the current evidence suggests that most of the Native American DNA that we can trace today, it largely is Asian DNA. And specifically, this is Eastern Asian DNA. And so scientists theorize that long before the Book of Mormon era, a relatively small group of people would have come to the Americas from Northeast Asia, and they would have done this by way of a land bridge. And I have this map here that illustrates this. This land bridge, you can see it connects Siberia to Alaska. And I have another illustration of it here. This orange is where the land bridge would have been. Obviously, this is all underwater today. And so it's believed that humans would have crossed this land bridge, known as the Bering Land Bridge, about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. And this would have been during the last ice age. So at this time, there were large glaciers on land, and because a lot of the water that's now in the ocean was trapped on land in these giant glaciers, sea levels were lower, and that caused this land bridge to form. And so this enabled migration from Asia, Eastern Asia, to North America. So these early people, they quickly spread across the Americas, and as far as we can tell, they are likely the primary ancestors of modern American Indians. And so if we look at the Book of Mormon text itself, it provides little information about contact between the Book of Mormon peoples and any others who may have lived nearby. So as a result of this, many early Latter-day Saints, they assumed that people from the Near East or West Asia, people such as Jared, Lehi, Mulek, etc., they were the first or they were the largest or maybe even the only group to settle the Americas. And so building upon this same assumption, many critics have insisted that the Book of Mormon, because it does not allow for the presence of these large populations in the Americas outside the Book of Mormon peoples, they're saying, okay, well, if this is the case, then we should see Near Eastern DNA. It should be identifiable among Native Americans today, and we're not seeing that, so that's a problem. However, if we look at the Book of Mormon text, we see that it actually does not specifically claim that the people in the Book of Mormon were the only or the largest group in the lands that are described. And as a matter of fact, clues in the Book of Mormon itself would hint at the presence of other groups. And so I have attached here this paper that I think is really interesting. It's by John L. Sorensen, really great paper. Basically talks about this idea that there were other groups in the Americas at this time period, and that there are some suggestions of that in the Book of Mormon text itself. We're not going to have enough time to go into this paper in detail in this video, but this paper is easily accessible online. It's free, and I would encourage anyone who's listening to give it a read. It's very interesting. Okay, so in line with this same idea that was put forth by the Sorensen paper, that there were other groups, we have a member of the first presidency who made this statement, and this was back in 1929. He said, "We must be careful in the conclusions that we reach. The Book of Mormon does not tell us that there was no one here before them, the people it describes. It does not tell us that people did not come after. So this was a statement made in 1929, and the church has, for the most part, followed this line of thinking as we continue forward in time to the modern day. Um, Similarly, I guess prior to the 1929 statement, Joseph Smith seems to have made some statements that would suggest that he was open to the idea of migrations other than those mentioned in the Book of Mormon specifically. And so many church leaders and scholars over the years have said, yeah, we think that it is fully consistent with the Book of Mormon, that there are other populations aside from the Book of Mormon peoples who are explicitly mentioned. And so, in line with all of this, in 2006, the Book of Mormon introduction was updated to say that the Book of Mormon peoples are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Prior to the 2006 change, the introduction had said that the Book of Mormon peoples were the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. But obviously, this change was made to reflect the understanding that the Book of Mormon peoples were, in fact, not the only or the largest group in the region, because obviously that is more in line with the DNA evidence that we have. And so to understand the genetic evidence that we do or don't have for the Book of Mormon, I thought that it would be useful to go over the basics of genetics real quick, just to explain how scientists use DNA to study ancient populations. And it will help us understand the difficulty of drawing conclusions about the Book of Mormon based on a study of genetics. So to start, let's talk about DNA for a minute. So obviously DNA, everyone's learned about this in high school biology. It's the set of instructions for building and sustaining life. And so I have this graph here, this, I guess, depiction, I should say. And so we have a cell here, and inside each cell we have a nucleus, and the nucleus houses our DNA. And so inside the nucleus of each cell, we have 46 units. They're called chromosomes. And so we get 23 chromosomes from each parent. And so I have a chromosome depicted here. And chromosomes themselves are made up of DNA, which is obviously what we're talking about. And so each chromosome contains over 3 billion instructions. And obviously that's a lot. And it's interesting to note that any two individuals, most of their DNA, 99.9%, is actually the same. And so it's many small differences that account for the variation that we see between people. And obviously these small variations can lead to some very big differences between individuals. And so we have these variations that will arise in DNA as a result of mutations. These occur randomly. These are just errors in DNA replication. And this occurs when we have cell reproduction. And over generations, mutations will accumulate. And then that is how you get unique genetic profiles because of these mutations. And so the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, they're called autosomes, and they shuffle the DNA that you receive from your parents. And then the 23rd pair specifically, that determines gender. And so the 23rd pair I have highlighted in the picture on the right-hand side. And so if you're XY, then obviously you'd be a male. And if you're XX, you're a female. And it's important to note that sons inherit the Y chromosome essentially intact from their fathers. And this will be important in just a minute. So now if we continue on, another important bit of information that we should know is that we don't just have DNA in the nucleus of our cells. We actually also have DNA in the mitochondria. And right now you're probably thinking back to high school biology, mitochondria, it's the powerhouse of the cell, all that good stuff. But we're not really talking about the energy function. We're going to talk specifically about mitochondrial DNA. So mitochondria don't have nearly as much DNA as the DNA that you'd find in the nucleus of a cell. Like I mentioned before, each chromosome has about 3 billion instructions. Mitochondrial DNA, we have about 17,000 instructions, so far fewer. And mitochondrial DNA specifically is inherited from the mother, and it's largely unchanged. So a mother, she passes her mitochondrial DNA to all of her children, but then only her daughters will then proceed to pass their mitochondrial DNA on to the next generation. And this is going to be important, as we will discuss in just a moment. Oh, yeah. I found this meme on the internet when I was looking up DNA memes. Has nothing to do with DNA, but I liked it, so I left it in. Anyway, so what's important to note is that scientists have identified certain combinations of mutations that are distinctive to specific regions of the world. And so we have some unique mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome profiles. And these are called haplogroups, and they are specific to certain regions. And scientists usually designate these haplogroups with letters of the alphabet. For the most part, I've chosen to leave out the letters and any other designations and just kind of simplify and talk about the regions instead, just to make things a little bit easier to understand and remember. And so if we look at the scientific consensus, we see that the vast majority of Native Americans, they have Y chromosome haplogroups and mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that appear to come from East Asia, like I mentioned before, as people migrated across that land bridge. We actually find not just this East Asian DNA, though it is the vast majority of the DNA that we see. We do find some DNA markers from other areas, including East Europe, West Asia, and Africa. Yeah. And so we find these markers in the modern native population. Of course, the problem is it's difficult to determine when they entered the gene pool, if that was before or after Columbus. And the reason why we don't really have good clarity on this issue is because the methods that we use to date DNA markers are not really sensitive enough to tell us when exactly within the last few hundred years to 1,000 years this DNA entered the gene pool. And unfortunately, when we're talking about the European conquest of the Americas, that was only a few hundred years ago. So it's not within the proper time frame for us to get a good handle on, okay, when did this DNA come into the gene pool? So we have these other markers, but we don't know when or where exactly they came from, which is a bit of a problem for us. So scientists do not rule out the possibility that there were other migrations that occurred as people migrated to the Americas. In fact, they think it was probably fairly likely. And I have this quote here from Marcus Feldman from Stanford University. He's population geneticist. He said, models that suggest a single one-time migration are generally regarded as idealized systems. There may have been small amounts of migrations going on for millennia. So over time, lots of small groups probably migrated to the Americas. And so now what I wanted to do is talk about a couple of phenomena that we see occur in the ways that populations and DNA change over time, just to kind of show some of the difficulties in really determining much of anything about the Book of Mormon based on DNA. And so to start, I wanted to talk about the founder effect. So the first problem that we encounter is, it's difficult to determine the veracity of the Book of Mormon based on DNA because we don't know anything really about the DNA that the Nephites and any other groups mentioned in the Book of Mormon would have brought to the Americas. We don't really know what to look for because it is possible that the people who would have come to the Americas would have had typical, what we would consider to be typical Near Eastern DNA, but we don't really know. It's possible that they had DNA from other regions. And so I have some examples over here on the right-hand side to kind of show this idea. So let's say that we have an initial population of lizards, and we have orange, yellow, and green lizards. Let's say that some of them hop on a log, or let's say people hop on a boat, and they end up on a different landmass. Well, we see that the lizards that hopped on this log, they're not representative of the original population. The orange lizards are left out. And so over time, what you'll have on this new landmass is you'll have just green and yellow lizards. And so if someone came along many years later, they might think, oh, well, these green and yellow lizards, they must have come from a population of green and yellow lizards. When in fact there were other DNA profiles in the initial population, but they've been lost because we've only taken a subsection of the initial population. And so we have a similar issue when we look at the Book of Mormon. We don't know what the initial DNA population was, first of all, but then we're taking a subset of that population and transplanting it someplace else. And so it's possible that we're leaving out some of the initial genetic diversity. And so I wanted to give an example of what we're talking about, just one more, just to kind of help this really sink in. So we're going to pretend I'm Italian for a minute. Let's say I have Italian ancestry, but my paternal lineage traces to an Asian haplogroup. And so this would suggest that at some point there was an Asian migration to Europe in the past. And so if I went with my family and I colonized a desert island, and then many years later, geneticists come along and they do a genetic study on the inhabitants of this island that I colonized, they might incorrectly conclude that my descendants and I, that we came from Asia. But obviously this would not be correct. We came from Italy, but we had this Asian haplogroup that shows up in our DNA. And so this kind of highlights the importance of understanding the initial DNA that we started out with, and we don't have any way to do that for the Book of Mormon, unfortunately. Okay, but this is obviously not the only issue that we have. Even if we knew that the Book of Mormon people had what we would consider, typical Near Eastern DNA, it is possible that their DNA did not survive to the present day, and we're going to talk about some reasons for why this would be the case, why their DNA markers might be lost or undetectable today. And so one of these examples would be population bottleneck. And so this basically occurs when there is some kind of natural disaster, disease, war, asteroid strike, whatever, some kind of big calamitous event that results in the death of a large proportion of the population. And so what can happen in these instances is some genetic profiles can be completely wiped out and lost. And so over on the right-hand side, you see this graphic that kind of symbolizes a population bottleneck. So we have all of this genetic diversity over in the left-hand side, and then there's some kind of event that squeezes the population through this bottleneck. And so most of the genetic diversity is wiped out, and we're left with only, obviously, these blue and red dots that are left over. And so in the future, you might be able to regain some diversity through genetic mutation, but any diversity that you had previously, any genetic diversity will be lost because those people are extinct now. Their DNA is gone. We can't get it back. And this is important because we have many examples of events like this occurring in the Book of Mormon. We have many wars that take place. We have the entire destruction of several groups of people with the destruction of the Nephites and with the destruction of the Jaredites. Additionally, there are many accounts of famine that wipes out entire populations. If you read about the events just prior to the Savior visiting the Americas in 3rd Nephi, we see cities being sunk, cities being burned, cities being destroyed by earthquakes, by tornadoes, all different kinds of things. And so these would also fall under the umbrella of a population bottleneck, these catastrophic events. And so all of these might potentially cause us to lose some genetic diversity. It would make it harder to determine the initial genetic profiles of the peoples in the area. In addition to the end of the Book of Mormon and the other catastrophes that take place in the Book of Mormon text, we have the European conquest following Columbus arriving in the Americas, which touches off another cataclysm. Obviously, as we have probably all learned about in history classes in school, as a result of war and mostly as a result of disease, many Native American groups experienced devastating losses, and these losses oftentimes were as high as 95%. And so I have a quote here from a molecular anthropologist. I forgot to include his name. He said, "This population reduction has forever altered the genetics of the surviving groups, thus complicating any attempts at reconstructing the pre-Columbian genetic structure of most New World groups." And so over here, I have on the right-hand side a graphic that just kind of demonstrates this. And so this graph starts at about 1520. If you remember, Columbus first sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So this is not terribly long after Europeans first arrived, and we can see the dramatic crash in the population as a result of death from disease. And within just a few short years, the population is just utterly decimated. Tiny fraction of what it had been previously. So aside from the founder effect and population bottleneck, we also have this phenomenon known as genetic drift, and this is essentially when you have a loss of genetic markers just due to random chance. And so I have this illustration here, which will hopefully enable me to explain this concept simply. So let's say that you have this jar here, and it has 20 marbles in it. Half are red and half are blue. Let's say that you, at random, draw a marble, you record the color, and then you put the marble back in. Let's say you do this 20 times. And then you fill a new jar with marbles based on the number of marbles of each color that you pulled out. And this would symbolize one generation giving birth to a new generation. And just because of pure chance, it is very unlikely that you're going to have a perfect 50-50 split like you did initially. There's a very high probability that you're going to have some slight advantage to one group. There's going to be more of one color. And so now let's say that we repeat the experiment again. We draw 20 times, replacing each time, and we record the number. Well, then, because there's now a population imbalance, it's likely that this population imbalance is going to actually continue to get worse over time. And so as a result of just pure chance, even though you started out with perfectly even distribution of these DNA markers, by the end, it is very likely that only one DNA marker survives. And so this simple exercise with the jars just shows how we can lose genetic profiles over the course of several generations. And it's important to note that the effect of genetic drift is especially pronounced in small, isolated populations, which doesn't necessarily apply to the Book of Mormon, but this next case does. Genetic drift applies when we have a small group that intermingles with a much larger population that has different DNA markers. And that is more in line with what we would expect to see in the case of the Book of Mormon. And so I have this example here that I think illustrates the idea of genetic drift very well. So we're just going to switch over to this, and I'll just let this play for a minute.
Okay. So, and I'll give you a simple example. You go back 10 generations yourself in time. If you want to know how many ancestors you had 10 generations ago, all you do is take the number 2, which is the number of people that you have each generation, and you elevate that to the power of that generation. So if you want to know how many ancestors you have 10 generations ago, you do 2 to the 10th. So that's 2 times 2, 10 times. You have 1,024 ancestors, right? Everybody would have that many ancestors. Yet when I look at my DNA, statistically, only about 10-12% of them had contributed DNA that I have in myself. So I have about the DNA of 100 of my 1,000 ancestors. That means that from a genetic point of view, the other 900 could have well not existed because they didn't contribute anything to me. And yet, even if one of them did not exist, I wouldn't be here today because it took these 1,000 people to have children when they did to fill the next generation and the next generation and the next generation down to me. So only one of these 1,000 people was late to come back home that night. His wife had a headache and didn't want to have a relationship that night, and you wouldn't be here. But yet, so you're genealogically related to these 1,000 people. They're all your ancestors, but genetically you only representing about 10% of them. So we,
Okay, yeah, and so that's Hugo Perego. He's a population geneticist, and so he just kind of illustrates how very easy it is for DNA to get lost. And he talked about 10 generations in his example. It's about 250 years ago. And with the Book of Mormon, we are talking about obviously 2,600 years ago. It's much longer ago, and so he talked about how the chances at 250 years ago, 10 generations, about 10% of your ancestors' DNA will show up. Obviously, that uh, percentage is going to be vanishingly small when you're talking about 2,600 years ago. So the idea that we would, find intact Nephite DNA, quote unquote, it's pretty unlikely. And I think, this, I don't want to belabor the point. This just kind of repeats what I said before. Yes, you have a small population, mixes in with a larger one. And so the small population's DNA is just going to be overwhelmed very, very rapidly. And so we would not find it surprising that their DNA might be lost. And so to sum up, we really can't say much about the Book of Mormon based on DNA, either in a way that would be critical of the Book of Mormon or that would be supportive of the Book of Mormon. There's not good enough evidence to refute the Book of Mormon, but there's really no evidence that we can point to that definitively says, yes, the Book of Mormon, it is true. And so there's this quote here from Elder Oaks that I really like. And he wasn't speaking specifically about DNA, but I think that the point is valid all the same. He said, "It is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon." And so I would just echo that. Obviously, ultimately, what it boils down to is faith. And so here are some sources that I've included that I drew information from as I was prepping this video. If you want to dive more in depth into this specific topic, I would recommend that you check out some of these sources. And if you have any other questions, feel free to include them in the comments section below, and I will do my best to answer them. So hopefully this was useful for all of you, and you'll have taken something away from this. Like I said, I appreciate feedback, comments, questions, and that's all I got for you. So have a good one. Peace.